Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome, but you're a bit late. On this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. This week, we are concluding our series on the evolution of the occult. It's been an incredible 22-week journey in which we've looked at everything from the birth of cinema itself all the way through to recent occult movies. This week, all we're going to be doing is taking a little look back at what we've learned over the last few months. I'm going to be reading some listener feedback. I'm also going to be counting down the listeners' top 10 occult horror movies. And also, as a little special treat, you're going to hear my interview with none other than the head of the Satanic Temple himself, Lucien Greaves. I sat down and chatted to him last year about a documentary called Hail Satan on Netflix, which, if any of you haven't caught Hail Satan yet, please watch it. It's a fascinating and brilliant documentary all about the Satanic Temple of America. And yeah, I got to sit and chat to the head of the Satanic Temple, Lucien Greaves. Nice guy, actually. Nice guy. So you're going to hear that chat with him a little bit later on. It's been a funny few weeks, hasn't it? The world has changed somewhat. We're all in lockdown right now. We're all in isolation. I have caught that pesky virus, coronavirus. I've been suffering with it for the last week or two. Me and my other half, Rihanna, we both managed to catch it somehow. We are absolutely two of the lucky ones, though, because we are absolutely fine. We got through it. Our symptoms were very, very mild. Pretty much just a sore throat and a cough, a little bit of a fever. And the weirdest part is that we completely lost all of our sense of taste and smell. And mine still hasn't completely come back yet, which is one of the worst parts, actually. But other than that, we're absolutely fine. But thank you so much to everyone that sent in their well wishes. We are all good. And I hope you are all taking care of yourselves, staying safe, staying indoors, embracing your inner introverts, and watching lots of horror films. So, as usual, seeing as this is the end of a series, it means that the podcast is going to go on a bit of a hiatus for a few weeks, maybe even a few months. But anyway, the next series of the podcast will begin in the summer, probably around June 2020. So that's when we'll be back officially. And I'll be giving the details about the next series and what kind of stuff we're going to be exploring at the end of this episode. But have no fear, if you still want to be able to listen to weekly content, then you can sign up to our Patreon. Over on patreon.com/evolution of horror, we will be bringing you a new episode every single week. Whether it's a review of a new release, whether it's a review of something old, whether it's a TV show, I let you guys pick what you want to hear. We've had tons of suggestions of what people want to hear us discuss over the next few weeks. I've got lots of guests who are up for joining me that I can record with remotely. So we are going to be bringing you weekly bonus content. I'm also going to start introducing a regular feature in which I recommend movies that are streaming online. So movies that you can check out on Shudder or Netflix or Amazon Prime. Because in this time of isolation, what we need right now are recommendations. We need good stuff to watch. So also on Patreon, I'm going to be bringing you regular mini episodes in which I give you a recommendation of the week. So if you want to get access to all of this content, you simply need to sign up and donate $5 per month. That's very, very little. That's just over $1 per week. And for that, you will have access to all of this bonus content. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, we're going to kick off this episode by taking a little look back at what we've learned over the last 23 weeks as we conclude the evolution of the occult.
I saw The Exorcist when I was about 11, which really fucked my shit up big time. My brother and I recorded it on VHS, and the day after I threw the VHS away.
Oh, I love it! Occult movies feel dangerous.
What an excellent day for an exorcism.
All subgenres of horror explore and depict the nature of evil in some way or another. But occult movies seem to go one step beyond that. It's somehow the films themselves that feel evil.
This is absolutely true. I mean, I remember really clearly, I lived in North London, going past the Classic in Hendon, which is where The Exorcist was showing everywhere, actually, but it was showing in the Classic in Hendon. and there were nuns standing outside sprinkling holy water on people as they went into the cinema.
So why is it that we can watch zombie films, slasher films, cannibal movies and be absolutely fine, and yet we could watch an occult movie like The Exorcist and we would need to destroy and burn the tape and douse ourselves in holy water?
The power of Christ compels you!
Perhaps it's because occult movies dabbled in religious evil, in ancient practices that at some point in time people genuinely believed in. And by watching these films, we were somehow actively involved in a satanic ritual.
And may all my transgressions be washed.
In many ways, watching a film can feel like a ritual. We sit down together as a group, we dim the lights, we abide certain rules and etiquettes, and we experience something emotional and something transcendent together as one.
But isn't things like going to Fright Fest something like a ritual? Isn't it something like
Absolutely.
going to a Satanic Temple to worship your gods?
Yes.
You know, and if your gods happen to be George Romero, then fine, that's great. You know, if your god happens to be Anubis, that's fine as well. But you know, some people gather at this sort of temple of horror.
Yeah. Even making an occult horror film can feel as dangerous as watching one.
With my a lovely person who was doing all the symbols.
Yeah.
Strict instructions not to use any proper sort of like occult symbols.
So that was actively kind of you were thinking about that.
Yeah. Well, it's just one of those things. It is a sort of essentially, it is a black magic kind of ceremony. It's a dark ceremony.
Yeah.
And you don't want that following you around.
No.
So.
But of course, really, the occult is ever present in all horror cinema.
Possibly for the first time in this whole sort of history of evolution of horror, you're going to find a lot of crossover with things you've done before.
And that's because occultism is the bedrock, the foundation of all horror cinema. It seeps its way into every other subgenre. Voodoo zombies are really occult monsters. So many folk horror movies explore witchcraft and religious practices. And even certain slasher monsters stem from the occult. Look at how Chucky was created.
Give me the power, I beg of you!
You'd be hard-pushed to find a single horror film out there that doesn't in some way evoke the occult. Indeed, the very first horror movie ever made, Georges Méliès's House of the Devil, was an occult movie.
It's the first time on film, as far as we know, that you really did have demons and bats and ghosts and skeletons and people being scared and then people defeating the baddie.
Yeah.
So you could say technically that's a horror film.
So if the occult lingers in all areas of horror, then how do we define a pure occult horror movie?
I suppose we also look at the original meaning of the word occult, which comes from the Latin word occultus, which means hidden or secret or concealed. And really what the occult was originally, there wasn't any sort of supernatural or paranormal elements to it. It just meant people looking for hidden knowledge or secret knowledge. And in some ways, science was, for a very long time, the occult. And you have things like alchemy, which sort of tried to set itself up as a science, but obviously wasn't. It's just over the years, it became more associated with demonic practices, with the supernatural, with ritual, with cult.
Occult horror movies depict something that's hidden, usually hidden in plain sight. A hidden lifestyle, a hidden ritual, a hidden evil.
It's still very much that question of, is it real, is it not real, how can this be real?
Yeah.
In the words of Rosemary, this isn't a dream.
Yes, this is really happening.
This is really happening.
Occult horror movies take place in a familiar, everyday setting, whether it's a New York apartment block, a suburban family home, or an American high school. Our main character resides within this world, but then, soon enough, discovers another. It might be a group of Satanists next door practicing an occult ritual. Or it could even be a demon or the devil himself that's possessed an innocent child.
And the beauty of Satanists, much like communists, is that it could be your next door neighbor, it could be anyone next door, and it's that fear of the normalized other.
If somebody who has power, whether that is like personal power through kind of witchcraft, or whether it's power through kind kind of summoning of demons or worship of Satan or something like that, how they can kind of use that against a target.
Yes.
And how the target often is unaware of that happening. That I find really scary, that idea that, you know, there could be somebody kind of almost like puppeteering you and you wouldn't know until it was too late.
Early depictions of occultism and witchcraft showed up in historical movies like Haxan, which made the occult look very much otherworldly, something that belonged in another time and place.
Haxan brims, as virtually no other film, in my experience, has, with a real breath of authenticity when it comes to medieval devilry.
Yes.
But, I think we carry around with us a kind of cultural collective memory of that time when we really were absolutely petrified by the reality of the devil, just as we were petrified by the reality of God.
It wasn't until the 1940s that Satanists suddenly started being depicted as regular-looking people living in Manhattan and hiding in plain sight.
Drink it, Jacqueline. There's nothing else for you to do. The game's got to die.
The Seventh Victim was a strange and bleak movie, but revealed something that until then hadn't really been prominent in popular culture, that the occult was being embraced by everyday folk, and that occult rituals were being practiced by educated, liberal, bohemian types in Western culture.
Funny thing, I always preferred sliding down the snakes to climbing up the ladders. You're a doctor of psychology, you ought to know the answer to that.
Maybe you're a good loser.
I'm not, you know. Not a bit.
But of course, thanks to people like Aleister Crowley, occultism as a practice was beginning to grow through the early half of the 20th century. And this became more and more prominent as youth culture began to change in the dawn of the 1960s.
I think younger people at that time, they'd grown up after the Second World War.
Yeah.
They'd grown up in an era of relative prosperity in America in the 1950s. Yeah. But that had brought with it this sort of rampant consumerism and materialism. And I think young people were looking for something a bit more spiritual.
Yeah.
And mainstream religion had kind of let them down. As the counterculture began to develop from about 66, 67 onwards, mainstream religion was very sort of dismissive of it. It was very sort of, the counterculture believed in drugs and believed in free sex and all the rest, all the things that the church wouldn't want you to do. So the church was not going to be an answer for these kids. So they started looking for more esoteric forms of worship. And of course, the occult and Satanism, it popped up, and there it was. It was right for the taking.
Filmmakers like Kenneth Anger tapped into the zeitgeist by making LSD-fueled occult movies featuring the music of artists like Mick Jagger and Bobby Beausoleil. Anger took the concept of movies as rituals one step further.
One thing that Anger has said, which is fascinating, this is what I love about him, in theory anyway, is that the whole idea of the magic lantern cycle is he intends his films to be used as a ritual. The idea being that with things like inauguration of Pleasure Dome and stuff, you're watching them cast a spell on you.
However, while Kenneth Anger was proving popular with progressive arty types, not so much with mainstream Hollywood, and his connection with people like Bobby Beausoleil, who ended up murdering somebody for Charlie Manson, didn't help the reputation that this lifestyle was connected with Satanism and evil. Suddenly, movies like The Devil Rides Out, Rosemary's Baby, and The Exorcist were depicting the fears of the moral majority, the fears that God is dead and Satan was coming to kill us all.
God is dead! Satan lives! The year is won!
It's no coincidence that so many of the biggest occult movies of this era featured the youth as the monster. After all, our youth were being corrupted by these grotesque, perverse new ways of life.
Have no fear, little one. I am here to protect thee.
These occult movies of the 60s and 70s were some of the best and most successful and most frightening because they were in some ways the oldest story in the book. They were simple tales of good versus evil, God versus the devil.
I cast you out! Unclean spirit!
Shove it up your ass!
In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ!
In some ways much less murky or progressive than other horror movies we were getting at the time, like Night of the Living Dead or The Wicker Man. These movies were playing to a mainstream audience, and they were playing very well.
So I think in a number of ways, it is, from my point of view, the greatest movie ever made. Not the greatest horror movie, but the greatest movie. It has a really weird verisimilitude that makes you think that you're watching something that's actually happening.
But of course, soon enough, these youngsters that grew up in the progressive 60s and 70s started making films of their own. And throughout the 80s and into the 90s, occultism was no longer something that was feared and became something that was embraced.
Ours is the time, ours is the hour, ours is the magic, ours is the power.
I think when you think about female power, it's a really innate way where you're thinking that female characters have power, because the depiction, especially I think probably when we were growing up and watching the way women were in media, you know, you had expected ways that people would behave, you know, just be a girlfriend or just do these things. But the minute you hold an actual power, suddenly all of those other genre defining this is the way things should behave are completely upended, and you're like, suddenly there's potential.
If a female character is a witch, it that is the characteristic that is kind of at the focus. And so if she is a housewife, or if she is a high school student or whatever, that part of her that would usually, for a female character, kind of be so like all-encompassing, always like takes the back seat to the fact that she is a witch.
Yes. Witches in particular were no longer these haggard, terrifying crones, these women that were coming to kill us all. Instead, they were empowered, nuanced, layered, and often morally ambiguous characters. And the monsters were the patriarchal power players.
What do men want?
Just a pretty woman to love and to take care of them.
Love me. Love me.
It is about tearing down sort of patriarchal power structures, and also it's about control over your own space, over your own body. I think the fear of witches is that they're misunderstood.
Yes.
It's unknown power.
Yeah.
And I think that's why people can sometimes feel that they belong, you know, when they see someone who is a bit different and unusual, but they have a strength about them. They suddenly think, okay, yeah, I can manage this too.
Witchcraft is just a way of concentrating energy. You can only work with what's already there.
Times have changed. We're living much more in a secular, scientific world, and we're not generally as terrified by the idea of devils and demons anymore. So why are occult movies still so popular? Perhaps it's the idea that no matter what you believe in, there is still potentially out there the existence of a systemic evil, something bigger and more powerful than us that is coming to get us, something that we cannot stop or prevent.
Look at me, Damien. It's all for you.
The world has gone insane.
It really
The
has.
world has got. I mean, in my 58 years on this planet, I've never known a time quite as terrifying in the real world as it is now. So I think, you know, horror films come back and sort of say to us, yeah, you're scared, but here's how you deal with it. This is the way of looking at it.
Right now, the modern world is a scary place. And I think no matter how educated or enlightened we've all become, there is still that lingering fear that somewhere in society, hidden away, is something bigger than us. Something pulling all the strings. Something evil. When it comes to the horror genre, there'll always be a special place for the occult. And there we go. What a fun few weeks it's been. This has absolutely been one of my favourite series of the podcast to record so far. I've loved every single film, and I've loved every single conversation that I've had with all of my amazing guests. And speaking of, I want to say a huge thank you to every single brilliant guest who joined me to discuss all things occult this series. So a big thank you to Kevin Lyons, David Huckvale, John Spira, Mary Wild, Sarah Cleaver, James Swanton, Adam Robinson, Paul Ridd, Michael Blythe, Jen Handorf, Graham Saunders, Anna Bugutskaya, Craig Lapper, Mark Kermode, Jamie Graham, Becky Dark, Lou Thomas, Eleanor Lazic, Louise Blaine, Josh Tonks, Stevie Webb, Rob Watts, Kat Davies, Rowena Alice, Rihanna Dillon, Dan Martin, Zobo with a Shotgun, Brad Hanson, Liam Gavin, and Mike Lee Graham. What an incredible list of people. A big thank you to all of those people for joining me this series. And I want to say one final thank you to the late, great Charlie Albright. Charlie was, of course, a regular guest on this podcast. He joined me this series to discuss all things Kenneth Anger, and then we did sadly lose him just a few weeks after recording that episode. Charlie was one of the funniest and most unapologetically bonkers people I ever had the chance of knowing, and we will all miss him so much. So a huge thank you one more time to the wonderful Charlie Albright. Okay, let's move on then. I'm going to be reading some feedback later on in this episode. I'm going to be answering some listener questions, and I'm going to be counting down the listeners' top 10 occult movies as voted for by you guys. But first of all, as a little bonus treat, I am going to play for you my discussion with Lucien Greaves. Now, as I mentioned, Lucien is the head of the Satanic Temple. And if you've never heard of the Satanic Temple, then you might be surprised to know it's not exactly as it sounds. These aren't a bunch of people who do evil biddings and worship the devil. They're actually a really interesting organisation. Now, I sat down and chatted to Lucien about a year ago. This conversation has been available on Patreon, so many of you might have heard it, but I thought this week, to top off the series, this would be the perfect way to end it, to see how far the idea of Satanism and the occult has come. Here is my discussion with the head of the Satanic Temple, Lucien Greaves. Hello, Lucien.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
Not bad.
Good.
Got to London yesterday around 7 a.m.
Wow, so you are severely jet lagged, I imagine.
Yeah, but they've given me some time, and I even have a day off on Saturday, so I'll be able to get out and explore.
Great, fantastic. First time in London?
It's my first time having any significant time in London.
Right.
I've only been like layovers before.
Yeah, of course. So first of all, I just want to ask you, for people that, may not, if they haven't seen the documentary yet and they don't know about the Satanic Temple, tell us a little bit about what that is. I mean, is it, what it might sound like? Do you worship the devil?
Well, no, we don't even worship the devil, but we are a federally recognized religious organization in the United States, tax exempt, recently announced and approved. And we are very clear that we're a non-theistic religious organization, meaning we don't advocate for any belief in the supernatural. We don't believe in a personal devil. To us, Satanism is a metaphorical construct. It's a literary construct. It kind of contextualizes our ethics and our works and our goals and our kind of feeling of where we belong in our culture. And we feel like that's what a religion should have, that if your deeply held beliefs are attached to that kind of narrative structure, that kind of cultural identity, your deeply held beliefs are just as important as anybody who would claim to have any supernatural belief. And in the United States, of course, we allow for certain privileges and exemptions in the name of religion. So to insist that one could only have those with deference to supernaturalism is extremely backward in my mind. And I think religious claims should be open, of course, to non-believers and non-theistic identifiers of all type. And I feel that non-theistic religion is the future of religion. Right, yeah. I think even for people in traditional religious organizations, Christians, I think if they think about it clearly and honestly, they'll realize they don't believe in a lot of the supernatural claims. They don't believe necessarily that Jesus is coming back from the dead and the apocalypse is nigh or any of that nonsense. But they do have a cultural attachment, and they do feel that their ethics are kind of defined by these biblical stories. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But they don't have to pretend that they believe in things that are intellectually insulting. And I think at the point where people feel more confident doing that or realize that they can do that, we're going to see a lot more of it.
Absolutely. So why specifically did you go for sort of Satan then, as opposed to just being a group called, atheists?
Right. Well, as it said in the film, atheism defines what you're not. Satanism defines what we are. And it wasn't like we all of a sudden manifested from out of a vacuum and said we want to provoke and offend Christians. Mm-hmm. A lot of us grew up in Judeo-Christian culture. This symbolism, the stories, they're very powerful to us. They were kind of programmed into us at a very young age, at which point you take these things at face value, right? And Satanism was very much something to be feared, something you needed to stay away from. And at a certain point in some of our lives, being able to embrace these blasphemous symbols was very much personally liberating.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much about what it meant to other people. It wasn't so much what it meant when it offended them. It was something that made us feel that we were personally declaring independence. Mm-hmm. And that's something that that's never left some of us, right? So it's very meaningful, and it couldn't be anything else. Mm-hmm. We couldn't just arbitrarily pick another mythological character or put another label to it. We feel that the kind of myth of Satan kind of defines who we are and where we are.
So how does something like this go down in America, calling yourselves the Satanic Temple? I mean, obviously, I think we all know, and as the documentary explores, America, even though it's supposed to be this land of religious pluralism, this kind of non-religious country, I guess, in some ways, we all know that it is quite a Christian country. There's a growing number, it seems like, of kind of Christian evangelical types, especially in power right now in America. It must be quite scary for you guys to go out and about in public, especially you as the kind of figurehead, as the front-facing, the public face of the Satanic Church. Is that dangerous?
Yeah, it is. And of course, a lot of people are very hostile to it. And there's been decades now in which theocratic nationalists have been fighting to gain exclusive access to the public square in the name of their religion. And ostensibly on paper, as a constitutional, pluralistic republic premised upon religious liberty, these equal access claims that the Satanic Temple are making, they shouldn't be considered novel. They shouldn't be considered outrageous at all. That's the meaning of religious liberty. But now we're kind of at the precipice of a new dark age in which we see the theocrats really making headway into trying to redefine the United States as a Christian nation. And to that end, these kinds of fights we're fighting for equal placement on public grounds, when they put up a Ten Commandments monument, we put up our own monument. Yeah. These aren't arbitrary, silly little games being played. When you allow that kind of thing, when you allow a voice to gain exclusive access like that, you are setting the stage for only the next encroachment into the civil liberties of people who don't identify with that particular religious voice. For example, you see in the film Hail Satan, our Arizona chapter asked to give an invocation before a city council meeting where they allow these religious invocations. People at the meeting in which they're discussing whether the Satanic Temple should be allowed to speak, which shouldn't have been a discussion to begin with, they're holding up dollar bills and noting that because it says, "In God we trust" on the dollar bills, which were put there around 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, they're saying that this is evidence of the exclusive license that Christians hold towards the public square. Yep. And you know that Ten Commandments monuments will be used in the same way. And pretty soon, people who don't identify with a particular religion are going to be second-class citizens, and we can't let that happen.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, you guys are activists, but you're careful activists, I would say. You know, from having seen what I've seen in the film, you make sure you're on the right side of the law. You make sure you use the law and the Constitution to your advantage. You're not going out there and being these kind of crazy radicals, are you? You're kind of playing by the rules in order to work the system, it seems like.
Well, we're very clear that we're a nonviolent organization, that we stand for a certain set of principles. And we really feel that the established law, if followed, is on our side on these types of things. Furthermore, analysis has shown that these kind of dissident movements, these kind of lower-level political movements, are much more effective when they are nonviolent. You lose a lot of sympathy, or your message gets lost if you start engaging in violence. And we simply don't need to do that, and we wouldn't want to see that happen. One of the things I found really fascinating about the documentary is the way in which it is kind of commenting on the very nature of religion and the flaws of organised religion, I think. You guys start off as this group that's basically an atheist group, a group that isn't in any way religious, but as it becomes this organisation and it grows and grows and it does become an established religion, it then starts to become problematic in the way that a lot of religions do, because you start getting people that maybe misinterpret what you guys are trying to preach or what you're about and take them to the extreme or take them in more violent directions. For example, one of the people we see in the documentary, her name's Jex Blackmore, somebody who was very much part of your group from the beginning, but then as the story progresses, as the organisation grows, she becomes more radical, and you actually see her publicly kind of threaten to execute the president and a whole bunch of other things. And so you guys have to get rid of her. You have to excommunicate her from the group. And is that just something that is indicative of all religions, do you think? That no matter what the original intentions are of the group, there are always going to be, as a religion grows, people that read certain things or interpret certain things in different ways. And there are always going to be extremists, to one extent or another. From a sociological perspective, I think the Satanic Temple is also fascinating, and sometimes I feel like I'm looking at it as an outsider because I can only author so much of what the Satanic Temple is, and my words can only have so much meaning insofar as they resonate with the population that this gravitates to. So we're going to see some people radicalize, or some people gain some idea of what they think is a purer form of what we're doing. But what I think is most interesting from the people who've separated from the Satanic Temple, claiming that they have a purer vision of what it could be or whatever else, is that they still identify with Satanism when they do that. So you see these schisms and you see these other smaller movements kind of being generated from the Satanic Temple, but it's, I think, not indicative of a lack of kind of structural integrity within the Satanic Temple. I think it's indicative of the power of Satanism now in our culture overall. That we're going to see so many people gravitating towards it, having different ideas of what it could be. And I think we're going to see Satanism in very short time. And by very short time, I mean, probably in another couple decades or less, it's going to be a very serious religious identification that's on all the pew polls and all the other types of reckonings to be had with religions and culture.
And I did find it interesting about how, other than that one moment we just mentioned with Jex Blackmore threatening to execute the president, there's actually very little mention of your current American president. And I just wondered, how important is what is going on in America right now to what's been happening and the growth of your religion and organization right now? I mean, is this the fact that it's gaining more and more people and followers? Is that a reaction to what's been happening in America? Look at Alabama, etc., and the growing kind of evangelical right Christian power.
I even if it weren't Trump, any Republican administration would be pandering to the theocratic nationalists, and that's been a problem with that party for some time now. And I think they need to divorce themselves from that movement. Trump has been all too willing, though, to embrace theocratic nationalism, especially putting a disturbed individual like Pence into the vice presidency.
Yeah.
But this has been ongoing for generations now. In the Eisenhower administration, they put the "In God We Trust" on money, and you see in the film, it was Cecil B. DeMille helping propagate the Ten Commandments monuments on the grounds to promote his film and other such efforts like that. But this didn't pop up all at once, you know. Yeah, but in any case, just the theocrats on the rise like this. It's helped people realize our relevance.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the documentary itself then, and sort of how that came to be. I mean, and how did you feel about this initially, about having a documentarian sort of track you and tell your story and follow this? Were you worried about how you guys were going to be portrayed and that kind of thing?
Oh, yeah, of course. And when I first got a message from Penny, my first thought was absolutely not. And not because it was her, of course, by any means, but because I had already turned down so many documentary offers. In the very beginning, we had pitches coming to us for people who wanted to do reality type shows premised upon the Satanic Temple, invitations onto daytime talk shows. And there had been this long-standing notion that we were just in it for the attention, and that couldn't have been more incorrect. And we shocked a lot of people, I think, by turning down their proposals for mere attention. And we had very kind of defined standards for how we would approach the media. I was very clear that I would never allow a kind of personal profile to be done. I wouldn't allow this to be boiled down to my own personal story, because I felt that denigrated the rest of the movement overall and turned things into a kind of cult of personality, which I think people are eager to have, but I think is kind of backward and kind of against our own kind of ethics. So when a documentarian comes to us, they're usually put off by the number of prohibitions I put on them. We're not going to do reenactments. There's not going to be these biographical vignettes. Penny's pitch, though, was very well thought, and she had obviously done a lot of research about what the Satanic Temple is and who we are, and she didn't come at us with insulting assumptions like she was winking and nudging and saying, like, hey, I get it, that kind of thing, that kind of insulting, I know you're not really a religion type thing, which we got a lot of too, which is infuriating to us, or would be. But she seemed to understand that there was a good deal of intellectual depth to what we were doing, and that against all odds and against everybody's expectations, that we're really quite open and honest about who we are. But still, nonetheless, I thought a documentary probably wouldn't be a good thing. But then I met with her and saw her previous film, Nuts, that was showing at a New York premiere. Yeah. And she did a Q&A, and I was particularly taken with her answers regarding this long-term feud she had been having with anti-vaccination people and her general skepticism of pseudoscience and superstition overall. And I saw that there was a lot of thought in what she was doing, and I really loved the narrative structure of Nuts. There's not a lot of documentaries I really like, or that I think put that amount of work into its storytelling tactics, So that made me think a lot differently of her, and ultimately led to agreeing to do this documentary. But that said, still having a documentary crew filming you and following you around for some 2 or 3 years and not knowing at all what they're ultimately going to do with that material. Yes. It's very harrowing.
Yeah, right? Of course.
So,
what was your reaction when you sort of first saw the completed movie? What did you think?
I first saw the completed movie with Penny and Gabriel, the producer of the film, in Gabriel's place in New York. And we were watching it on his television, a screener version. And I'm watching this in a mindset where I'm just hoping it's not constructed in any way to make us look bad. Yes. That it's not constructed dishonestly in any way. So I feel like I'm watching it scene by scene, just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop or fact-checking it as it goes along. So by the end, I didn't really have a good feeling as to what this film actually was. I'm making sure it wasn't certain things. Yeah. But I had no idea what an audience would make of it. I didn't even know if it was a good film.
Right, yeah. Well, it must be hard to get that objectivity.
Right, I'm just too close to the topic matter, so I was just wondering what are people going to see when they watch this? What's going to speak to them, if anything? Is this film going to do well? I had no idea at all. It wasn't until I saw it several more times with audiences that I felt like I had some feeling of what it was. And it was interesting to me to see what audiences applauded for, what they laughed at, and some of the things that they laugh at, and people see a lot of humor in the film.
Yes, yeah.
It was completely lost to me.
Right, that's interesting.
Like when I'm talking to a subcommittee in Arkansas, and they're completely puzzled, and they look just exasperated and perplexed.
Yes.
It's funny now.
Yes.
But it needed to be pointed out to me by audience laughter that it was funny at all.
Yeah.
Because in the moment when I'm doing these things, of course, I go to Arkansas under threat of death anytime, and I'm just doing business and I'm trying to lay out our case. There was nothing funny about it in the moment, but it's interesting to now kind of look back at these events and see them somewhat through the filter of this film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. And it is funny. It's kind of playful, I think, but it's very heartfelt too, I think. But I think when it initially begins and you see you guys wearing the horns and the capes and the get-up and the robes, I think initially I thought, is this going to be quite, not hostile, but quite kind of dismissive of you guys? But I think it deliberately kind of sets it up in that playful way and then subverts it slowly. That's what it seemed like to me.
I have to give Penny a lot of credit for that, because it's really difficult to kind of capture both the angst and the horror of what we do along with the humor of it. Because, even though I said I didn't recognize the humor in some things, I went in doing some of these things full well knowing that there's a humor value to it.
Yeah.
And that's inherently hilarious. But at the same time doing it in worrying that somebody's going to shoot me, right? So there's that kind of bizarre disconnect there. And I guess you kind of have to have a grim sense of humor to do what we're doing.
Yeah, definitely. No, absolutely. I do think that there's an interesting connection that's touched upon in the documentary as well, between people as part of this religion and also subcultures of people that like metal music or people that play Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s or myself, I'm a big horror movie fan. This is a horror movie podcast. And, why do you think there are those sort of connections? There must be a lot of connections there as well with the sort of horror film community, I imagine, and people in your group.
Oh, that's part of what you would call the religious syncretism of Satanism, all those elements that were demonized from popular culture.
Right, yeah.
Some people just embraced them and said, oh, well, if this is Satanism, that's what I like, So some of us grew up, playing Dungeons and Dragons, listening to heavy metal music. At the same time, these zealous and hysterical theocrats are yelling about how these things are making people into Satanists.
Yeah.
And it's only a half joke when our Arizona chapter head says, well, in retrospect, I guess so, but it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The more they define everything you like and embrace as satanic, the more primed you are to accept Satan into your life.
Yeah, you just kind of take ownership back almost.
Right,
yeah, definitely.
exactly.
Do you still find that you're kind of still battling that reputation from the satanic panic of the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s of, people like yourselves might have been seen as, slaughtering babies or doing all of that stuff that the news were believing us to think,
Yeah, but I think the difference between the Satanic Temple and certainly between any, the difference between the Satanic Temple and any previous satanic organization or anything else is that we're really not allowing ourselves to be victimized by that.
Yeah.
And we're really aggressively fighting back against that kind of witch hunter mentality wherever we see it. And to that end, we have a whole campaign where we're trying to initiate mental health care reform to take away the kind of pseudoscientific practices, the sanction of pseudoscientific practices that led to some of these narratives about satanic ritual abuse in cults. Because a lot of this came from kind of a fringe society within the psychotherapeutic community that was using recovered memory therapies. The same kind of hypnotic regressions, sodium amytal interviews, guided image therapies, these types of things that cause people to believe they're abducted by aliens or that they can recall past lives. These were being used to get people to recall hidden memories of satanic ritual abuse that never occurred. And these practices are still in place, and they're still in place in the United Kingdom, in Australia, and in the United States. And it's mostly spearheaded now by an organization called the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, which is kind of the final refuge for people who believe in Illuminati mind control and satanic ritual abuse. And, you know, believing in these conspiracy theories isn't a crime, but I feel that giving licensed mental health professional sanction to the propagation of these beliefs to the mentally vulnerable, that should be considered a crime. And these people should definitely lose their licenses. And we've gone after, we've gone after therapists who still use these tactics, and we're trying to get their licenses taken away.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're on the forefront of these kinds of battles, and we're very vigilant to make sure that things like Pizzagate don't spiral out of control into an all-encompassing moral panic like the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s was.
Yeah, of course. I'm really interested to ask you actually a little bit about the movie The Witch from a few years ago, because I remember famously, I loved the movie and it was endorsed by you guys, right? And that was actually the first time I'd heard of the Satanic Temple was because you guys had endorsed The Witch. And I think that gave that movie that much more publicity, actually, and that much more kind of notoriety, that maybe how scary or dark is this movie going to be because it's been endorsed by the Satanic Temple. I just wondered what it was about that particular movie that made you guys sort of speak out and endorse it.
That was the production company reached out to us and asked us if we would endorse it, and they helped, and they budgeted for the events, the kind of ritual events that would help promote it, and I was very concerned, about what the message of the movie would be.
Yes,
but I really liked, and some people objected to that because there are the supernatural elements in the film.
Right. Yeah.
But I felt the film was open to interpretation enough, and I felt like the whole beginning part of the movie showed the oppressive environment of what it meant to live in a society where people believe these things, right? And I felt it was very accurate, and I really loved the fact that they, in the film, in the construction of it, they used scripts, from testimony and things like that, from contemporary to the time period they were showing. And then I thought it migrated into showing what it would be like if these things were real, right? I didn't think it was an endorsement of supernatural belief, but I thought it was very artfully done, and I thought it was just one of the better movies I had seen.
Yeah.
In a long time. I really liked that movie a lot. So I thought it would have been a misstep for us to not give that the endorsement. Right?
Yeah, it's great. Are you a fan of the horror genre in general? Do you like horror films?
I'm a fan of good horror films.
There are a lot of bad ones.
Yeah, there are a lot of bad ones. Sometimes I'm a fan of bad ones too, though.
Yeah.
If they're genuinely bad. I can sometimes get annoyed when things are camp for their own sake. That they can't be self-aware.
Yeah.
And I'm a real big fan of bad films in general, and some of the I'm really a fan of this kind of genre of these self-financed films, usually by older men who want to live out their fantasies on film. Absolutely. And cast themselves as an action star, very unconvincingly so. Those are great. Neil Breen.
Yeah, Neil Breen.
I love Neil Breen films. Those are my favorite. And I've been trying to get his attention on Twitter.
Have you?
Yeah, and I'm trying to get him. I'm trying to persuade him to cast me as a villain in his next film.
Oh my God!
And I feel like I've got his acting standard down. He must dictate to them how to act, right? I think he took one acting class, and in that class they must have done that kind of exercise where it's like, okay, say the line and inflect it various different ways to see what works. And he thought that was how you should deliver your lines in the film. So I feel like if I did an audition, I would tell him, like, Neil, I want to be in your film. I want to be in your film.
Good, yeah.
I want to be in your film. because so many people talk like that in his films, and I think then he would think, right, I don't need to give this guy direction.
This guy,
he's perfect,
he's the one.
right?
Yeah, perfect. What do you think of the way, because some of the most famous and loved horror movies and some of the scariest are the ones that deal with the devil, right? Movies like The Exorcist and The Omen and Rosemary's Baby, of which there are clips in Hail Satan. What do you think of that and the depiction of Satanists in those types of movies? Because it's usually very much kind of like the priests are the good guys, the demons, the devils, whatever, the bad guys.
I used to feel that fiction had a carte blanche, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like if people take any of this seriously, that's their own problem, right? They shouldn't. And a good story is a good story, and why not? I have to say, my perspective has shifted a bit, and at a certain point, I feel like there is a certain responsibility especially if you are going to be portraying a certain population, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're going to be depicting a religious group and ascribing to them certain practices that they don't engage in, things like that, in a way that it might have ramifications for what people believe about this religious identification or whatever else, I can understand now why people object. I understand also what objections were against X-Files. I mean, at the time, I thought it's just ridiculous if people take this seriously and that people object to the idea of these things being portrayed this way. But unfortunately, a lot of people do take these things seriously, and how we treat fiction has ramifications for the culture overall. And I mean, to some degree, it's up to us to make sure people understand what it is that compels people to identify as Satanists, and make sure that people realize that it's not because we venerate evil or engage in cruelty and violence and everything else. And I kind of think that the fiction will come to recognize that. Yeah. And it's kind of a feedback loop on its own. Yeah. But that said, still a lot of the supernaturalist stories are the ones where the kind of bullshit we see on the History Channel about Bigfoot and stuff like that, it's begun to piss me off as I get more old and crotchety.
Amazing. Finally, then, I just want to ask you, what's next for you guys? What's the future of the Satanic Temple? What are you sort of hoping that will happen next?
I think for a while now we're going to be caught up in the abortion debates.
Right.
We just yesterday claimed exemption from fetal burial laws that the Supreme Court upheld for Indiana. And that places it squarely in the domain of religion,
right? Yeah.
When they're putting ceremonial standards on the disposal of biological waste, or at least we feel it's up to the woman herself to contextualize whether it's biological waste or whether it's an individual deserving of unique burial practices rather than simple biological waste disposal. And it's really difficult for anybody to argue that that's not a matter of religious perspective.
Yeah.
We're claiming exemption from it. And I think that is going to be a battle that will be immediately fought, and you can expect to see in litigation very soon. And it's one of those that's so contentious right now, as more people are realizing that we're at a brink of a new dark era or a new dark age, that the Satanic Temple is going to be seen as very relevant to those who embrace it and those who are our opposition.
Lucien, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And there we have it, the brilliant Lucien Greaves. If you want to find out a bit more about the Satanic Temple and you haven't seen the documentary, please head on over to Netflix and check out the documentary Hail Satan. That's the movie all about the Satanic Temple of America, and it's a really fascinating, surprisingly sweet documentary about this group of people. I, for one, am completely convinced I am ready to join. I'm ready to become a Satanist. I'm not sure what my Catholic mother would think of that, but there we go. I love those guys. Speaking of, I'm going to be doing some feedback now. I'm going to be reading some emails that I got from you guys, answering some questions, and then I'm going to end the series by counting down your top 10 occult movies. And this might be a good opportunity for me to address something that has been brought up a couple of times, and I'm going to read out a post from somebody on the discussion group. This is a post from Sarah Callahan from a few months ago. She posted this on the 28th of January. It took me ages to actually spot the post, and I thought rather than reply to it in the discussion group, I would take the opportunity to raise it now and reply. So the post from Sarah says, I'm really enjoying the occult series for the most part, and I'm really looking forward to the episode on the original The Omen, as it's one of my favourites. So that's obviously, this was posted before the Omen episode went out. That being said, I am a practicing Catholic, and while I respect that the host and several of his guests are agnostic, I'm hoping they'll leave their ambivalence of or occasional contempt of religion out of the episodes. I've heard several instances of it in the recent episodes, and I don't think their personal views of faith and religions really belong in discussions of the film. Does anyone else feel the same, or am I taking this too personally? And then we've got a bunch of varying responses from different people in the group. Sarah, I just wanted to take the opportunity to apologise to you if any of the discussions have in any way offended you, or anyone else out there listening who is of any kind of faith or any kind of belief. I never intended to get any way kind of anti-religious on this podcast. I think because of the nature of these films, because they deal, especially Western horror movies, they deal so much with Catholicism and Christianity and then notions of the devil. It's a subject that kept coming up quite a lot. But I myself never mean to sound offensive or never want to in any way demean people's faith or people's religion. I actually was brought up Catholic. My mother is a Catholic and my dad is an atheist. So I always like to think I was brought up in a very kind of balanced environment. And yeah, I don't actually have any faith or belief or practice any religion anymore. But I do find the whole thing very fascinating. And I think that's why I quite like to hear other people's viewpoints on it. So I have asked most of my guests about their own beliefs this series because it kind of felt relevant to the films to me. Sadly, there just weren't many guests out there that did have faith, so it turned into a weekly discussion between two atheists. So I understand, Sarah, how that might have sounded a little bit like we were being anti-religion or anti-Christianity in any way, but it was never intended. And so I just wanted to say for the record, I am sorry. I hope you weren't offended, or I hope you weren't put off by the episodes or by the discussions. And that goes for anyone else out there listening to, anyone else with any faith. And while I'm on religion, let's go to the other taboo subject, which is politics. So this is a review that was left on the 28th of December, so a few months ago, by Martin 197666. And he starts off, the first half of the review is really, really lovely and flattering. I won't read all of that, but it was an absolutely lovely start to the review. It's a 5-star review. But in his second paragraph, he says the following. Some people have complained that the podcast is too left-wing, and I would like to address Mike directly if you're listening. Mike, you do have some conservative listeners. I'm one of them, and I can't be the only one. More than half the country voted for Brexit, and nearly half voted for Boris Johnson. It seems likely that this huge demographic overlaps with the horror fan demographic that you appeal to. The bloke who called you a communist was being silly and rude, which I don't forgive him for. I mean, I didn't actually mind that, but somebody did accuse me of being a communist in an earlier review. But you do have a left liberal perspective, and some of the discussions are wildly more politically correct than is normal outside London. I wouldn't ask you to change your perspective, that would be outrageous. Grown-ups can like and listen to people they disagree with, but please just remember that you are addressing some people who don't share that perspective. I hope that others are able to love the show as much as I do. Thank you, seriously, best podcast ever. Thank you so much, Martin. I really do respect that, and I understand. And again, I have my own views. We all have our own views. I make jokes a lot of the time. Me and my guests, probably, we're all in this very London liberal bubble, and we probably do make throwaway comments that might seem anti-conservative or anti-Brexit or whatever else. And I do apologise, and I am going to try and stop that now because I don't want to piss people off, and I really don't mean to offend anyone. Again, I do have a lot of people in my life and in my family who are more conservative. offensive. And it's not an issue for me. I can make jokes because I think it's funny, but I never mean to offend anyone. So similarly to with the religious thing, I don't ever want to make any listeners of this podcast feel alienated. We are, first and foremost, a horror movie discussion podcast, and it should be an inclusive environment. So I promise that from now on, I'm going to try and keep things as apolitical as possible, unless it's absolutely necessary to the film we're discussing. But thank you so much anyway for taking the time to send me feedback, to send me reviews, to send me emails. I love hearing from you guys, and I do read every single review and every single email that I get, even if I'm not able to instantly respond. Okay, I'm going to then move on to some general kind of occult related emails. So I got loads of feedback from you guys telling me about what you thought of this series, about some of your favourite occult movies, about some movies that I neglected to include this series, and some other general feedback. So I'll try and whiz through as many of those as I can. This email comes from Paul Allen. Paul says, this series has been awesome, one of my favourites so far, even though occult movies are not my absolute favourites of the horror genre. I really appreciate how your pool of guests is slowly building, as much as I love hearing from your regular guests each series. In terms of the occult, I would like to add a few thoughts on what it actually means. As you have covered, it means hidden. But what in fact is being hidden, and from whom? From my current master's studies in education, it seems that what was being hidden was sacred knowledge, tied up with religious doctrine and their interpretation, some of which were potentially heretical in nature. As I'm sure you know, counter-Reformation Europe was a very dangerous place thanks to the Spanish Inquisition, so a lot of this knowledge went underground and was subsequently encoded in arcane manuscripts, the like of which horror writers have been having fun with ever since. Witches are, of course, the most infamous examples of this social hysteria, especially those who still retained hidden knowledge in folklore, much of it to do with midwifery, herbal medicine, etc., all of which was uncountenanced by the church and hence deemed devilry. Without this persecution and bloodthirsty madness, however, we would have had none of the fun in horror your latest series has been exploring. So in my estimation, it was all worth it. Thanks, Paul. It's really interesting. It is really interesting because it's a fascinating term, occult, and I really find that interesting. So it's great to hear a little bit more about the history of that. Thank you so much for sending that email, Paul. Here was a quick email from Stephen, who asked a question. Stephen Rowden. He said, "Hi, Mike. Really loved this series, but I was wondering why Hereditary wasn't included." Thanks for the podcast, Steve. Yeah, Steve, we've already covered Hereditary. That's why. I mean, of course, I do consider Hereditary to be an occult movie, but we already covered it. So when the film first came out in cinemas, me and Anna Bogatskaya did a whole spoilerific hour-plus long discussion, so you can still find that. If you head on over to evolutionofhorror.com and look in bonus episodes, you will find an entire episode dedicated to Hereditary. There are a few people that asked me that about why Hereditary wasn't covered this series. Same goes for the Suspiria remake. Both of those films were covered when they were released in cinemas as bonus episodes. So if you want to hear mine and Anna's thoughts on Hereditary and on Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria, just head on over to the website and you can find episodes on those. Okay, thank you, Stephen. This email comes from Harry Allard. "Hi, Mike. Thanks for another great series. Two of my favourite occult movies are A Dark Song and The Shout." I've never heard of The Shout, Harry. I'm also a huge fan of Richard Stanley's amazing documentary The Secret Glory, the title borrowed from the main man Arthur Machen, which charts some of the history of occultism in the early Nazi Party and use of occultism to further their propaganda. He made another occult documentary, The White Darkness, about Haitian voodoo and the problems its practitioners face under occupation by American troops and their imperialist evangelical Christianity. Both are really imaginatively edited, dreamlike, and very hallucinatory for documentaries. Stanley really is a genius. Anyway, thanks for the best horror podcast out there. I hope we get a bunch more seasons. Also, shout out to Brad Hansen for being the funniest funniest guest. The Berlin coverage on Patreon was fucking great. Also, watch Biotherapy. Cheers. Thank you, Harry. You're going to give Brad Hanson a big head by saying that, but I will pass that message on to him if he's not listening. And thank you for those recommendations for the Richard Stanley documentaries. I've got to admit, I need to check out more Richard Stanley stuff. I've only seen his feature films that are fictional. So I think I've seen the biggies like Dust Devil, Hardware, Colour Out of Space. I've not seen any of his documentaries, and they do sound fascinating. So I'll read those titles again for anybody that wants to check them out. The Secret Glory is the one that charts the history of occultism in the Nazi Party, and The White Darkness about Haitian voodoo and its problems under American occupation. I'm going to definitely check those out. Thank you so much for that feedback, Harry, and for those recommendations. Okay, I've got another email here from Keith Bauman. Keith says, firstly, I just wanted to say how superb your podcast is. Love listening to people sharing the same love of horror, and your chats and topics are brilliant. Also love the homework of watching a couple of movies each week, mostly a revisit, but quite a few new gems that have been excellent. As a massive horror fan born in the 1970s, my favourite occult movie is The Exorcist. It was the film with so much hype around it, and after several dodgy Betamax versions, they finally had that 90s re-release. It's a perfect cinematic experience building to a crescendo of epic proportions. My older sister has been unable to watch horror since she saw it, although I'm hoping she'll watch Lords of Chaos as she loves her metal. More recently, and thanks to you, I absolutely love A Dark Song because it's so well played and believable throughout, and despite being in a mansion, it's somehow still so claustrophobic. Thank you so much, Keith. Let's see whether the rest of the listenership agrees with you that The Exorcist is the greatest occult horror movie. What do we think? Next email comes from Joel Jones. He says, hi, Mike. My biggest feedback is I missed some of the standard trappings of the podcast. I missed the quiz episode. It was fun seeing if I knew the answers and playing along, and I'm not sure why it didn't happen this series. Let me just answer that for you now, Joel. Usually the quiz would happen on this episode, so on the concluding episode of every series. Sadly, my quiz master Brian Ryan just wasn't available this year, and of course due to COVID and isolation and all other problems, I didn't get a chance to sit down and record that quiz with anybody. So sadly it didn't happen, but maybe we should see whether or not we can make some sort of online quiz game happen. Maybe we could all do a big play-along quiz. I could write some occult questions and we could keep scores, or figure out a way to do it online. If any of you know how I could pull that off, let me know. Maybe we could organise something on the discussion group, a big horror quiz that we could all get involved and play along with. Because I love the quizzes too, and I miss them. Joel then continues his email and he says, the bigger miss for me is the television episode. There was no television episode of this series. It seemed like the perfect time to talk about American Horror Story, Outer Limits, The Twilight Zone, Tales from the Dark Side, and my absolute favourite, the Canadian Friday the 13th series. I'm sure there are many more as well. Thank you for the bonus content. I also love being a Patreon member and can't wait to see what comes next. Oh, thank you so much, Joel, for that feedback. Yeah, I am sorry that I didn't get a chance to cover any television this series. There was just simply too much. There were too many films. I didn't want this series to go on for 35 weeks. So I had to decide what I was going to cover and what I wasn't going to cover. And sadly, you're right, we didn't get time to cover any television. However, when it comes to shows like The Twilight Zone, Tales from the Dark Side, even American Horror Story and Friday the 13th, I've actually got other plans for them. They are all going to sit very nicely in a series that I'm planning at some point on anthology horror, sort of portmanteau horror. All kind of horror films and TV shows that contain lots of little self-contained stories. So at some point in the future, I will, of course, cover all of those TV shows. So don't worry, they will get discussed at some point. Okay, here's an email from John Hargreaves. Hello, John. He says, this is probably the most simple yet exciting feedback you're going to receive. bravo. In all seriousness, I've enjoyed the occult series. I'm not a big fan of this subgenre as a whole, but the more I've listened, the more I've realised there are some great films out there that cover the occult. I do have one complaint, and it goes to Brad. I've made it very clear on the Facebook group and on Twitter, I need to hear Brad's opinion on The Convent. I'm going to keep harping on until we at least get a Patreon episode with a deep dive into Coolio's incredible performance of a stoner cop and the delivery of, put on fake dodgy dramatic English accent now, the dagger of despair. Fake dramatic English accent. The dagger of despair. I don't know, I've not seen the film. I mean, it has demons giving blowjobs and then chomping down. If this isn't in Brad's wheelhouse, then I give up. Also, am I wrong in saying that yourself and Brad in Series 1 did a sort of best of the worst? If so, please bring it back with the also-rans. If not, please do it. I'm sure I'm not alone in wanting to hear you guys have a discussion about the bargain basement selection. Anyway, thank you so much for yet another amazing series, and I can't wait for the next. Stay safe, John. Thank you very much, John, for that email. I'm going to have to forward this on to Brad, aren't I? Because really this is feedback for Brad. To be honest, that film does sound very much up Brad's street. I'll be very surprised if he hasn't already seen it, John, to be honest. And if he hasn't, then I don't know what he's doing. I mean, he's wasting his time right now in isolation if he's not watching The Convent. So good recommendation. Maybe we will see if we can get time to do a Patreon discussion of it. Although if that means I need to watch this film, I might not bother. And yeah, in terms of Series 1, Best of the Worst, I don't think we did. Although in the first series on slasher movies, I did do a whole episode on the slasher slump, the kind of era when slasher movies went very much downhill in the early 90s, and Brad joined me for that one, so maybe that's what you're thinking of. Not as many other subgenres have had such a kind of saturated low point as much as the slasher series did, so maybe I haven't brought that back since the slashers, but you know, this could easily be something we could bring back. Again, as long as I don't have to spend too much of my precious time watching bargain basement films, I'm more than happy to let Brad watch them and then tell me all about them. So maybe we'll see if we can make that happen in the next series. Thank you so much for that email, John. Okay, this email comes from Russell Bailey. Hello, Russell. He says, "Hi, Mike. I just wanted to thank you for the series. This is the first one I've mostly been able to keep up with, and it has been so much fun to dive into this subgenre. It's certainly one of the more diverse that you've covered. This series began around the birth of my second child, and I spent the first month or so watching the older films rather early in the morning, and that really is the right time to watch black and white occult films. My favourite, and one of my all-time favourite horrors, is The Omen. But the film I would never have watched had it not been for your incredible series was Night of the Eagle. I bloody loved it. Feels like a film that deserves a degree of reappraisal. Hope you're doing okay right now in these strange times, Russell." Thank you so much, Russell, and congratulations on the birth of your second child. That's so exciting. He was literally born into your occult viewing, which is kind of exciting. And I agree with you. Night of the Eagle is a fantastic occult movie. I was so glad to see it and cover it for this series, and I'm really glad that people are getting to watch it for the first time. If you haven't seen Night of the Eagle, I would urge any of you who haven't to check it out. Okay, next up I'm going to play a little voice message. Here is a message from listener Steve Collins and his pick for his favourite occult movie.
Hi Mike and everyone else at Evolution of Horror, it's Steve Collins here. I think my favourite occult movie, maybe not the very best, but my favourite, might just be The Autopsy of Jane Doe. By the time I was old enough to watch the real classics, The Exorcist and The Omen, etc., you'd already heard about them and what to expect. But The Autopsy of Jane Doe really hit me quite hard as something completely unexpected. It wasn't what I expected. It took me to places I didn't really think it would, and its building sense of dread all the way through was quite exceptional. Love that film. And a great series, Mike. Thanks so much, mate.
Thank you so much for that message, Steve. I wanted to take this opportunity to play this now because The Autopsy of Jane Doe didn't quite make it into the listeners' top 10 occult movies, but it did come very close. There's a hell of a lot of love for The Autopsy of Jane Doe. And I also got some really nice comments and emails from people saying, thanks to the podcast, they watched it for the first time, which is great. It's a really scary film, I think. I just discovered this really interesting message from Carmen on the discussion group. Now, when we discussed The Autopsy of Jane Doe, we talked about how there is a moment where Brian Cox's character, who runs a morgue, keeps little bells, chiming bells tied to the toes of all of the dead bodies in the morgue in case they wake up. And me and Rihanna actually had a discussion about whether or not they genuinely still do that in real life. And we weren't sure. Anyway, I received this message on Facebook from Carmen AW. So Carmen says, Mike, after listening to your Autopsy of Jane Doe, you mentioned something about dead bodies and bells, and I thought I would give you some info. I used to live in a funeral home, so it obviously had a mortuary out the back, not in the basement. My husband was the manager, so regularly worked on bodies. Now, in Australia, autopsies are done in the hospital by our government health service, and then the body is transferred to the funeral home for further prep for the funeral. When the person dies, an on-call doctor attends to the home to pronounce the person deceased, unless they are already in the hospital. It involves a bunch of tests and measures to make sure they are actually dead. So in a nutshell, by the time they get to the morgue for the autopsy, and I should clarify that only happens if the death was suspicious, no bells are required. Hope that was interesting. I'll say that Halloween was often a treat, but nobody ever came to our door. That's a shame. Carmen, thank you so much for that. I knew that they can't still be putting bells around the toes of dead bodies, but it was good to have that confirmed. So thank you very much for that feedback.
Hi Mike, Andrew Pope here. My favourite occult horror? Well, tricky question. I love Argento Suspiria and especially his Inferno, and I love Carpenter's Prince of Darkness and especially his In the Mouth of Madness. Rosemary's Baby is a classic. A Dark Song is wonderful, but my absolute favourite occult horror has to be Jacques Tournier's The Night of the Demon. It is supremely creepy. It has a genuinely threatening villain, and its ending is so good that, frankly, Sam Raimi kind of ripped it off a little for Drag Me to Hell. And why not? Who can blame him? Night of the Demon, it's a masterpiece. Bye.
Thank you so much for that voicemail, Andrew Pope. I love Night of the Demon. I actually thought it was going to get voted into the top 10, but alas, it didn't quite make it. It was a tough one. This particular subgenre has got so many big hitters, so many classics. I probably could have done a top 20 for this one. And before I get into the top 10, I'm just going to play one more voicemail, and this comes from Carl Dunlop with his pick for the best occult horror movie.
What's good? Evolution of Horror. It's Kinal, DFAFD. If we're talking occult films, I got to say one of my all-time favourites is The Sect from 1990. Suave on the buttons. Beautifully shot piece of Italian lunacy. Satanic cults up to all kinds of mither and some herons being bastards. Safe.
Thank you so much for that voicemail, Carl. I've never heard of The Sect. I'm going to have to check this out. Your description of it made it sound absolutely amazing. Even Brad didn't mention The Sect in his also-rans list, so I'm going to have to track it down. For anyone else who wants that recommendation, again, that's called The Sect from 1990. That's Carl's favourite occult horror film. Thank you so much. I will be sure to check that out. So, now it's time to get into your top 10 occult movies. I'm going to run down from 10 to 1. Now, you guys voted via Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and email. Hundreds of you, literally hundreds, voted and gave me your lists, and I've managed to collate all of them together. I used the usual point system, so I gave 5 points to each number 1 pick and 1 point to each number 5 pick and kind of scaled it accordingly. And if you sent me a list of 5 that were in no particular order, I gave a middle middling 3 points to every single film. So that's how I scored it, and I've now got the top 10 occult movies as voted for by you. So at number 10, an absolute banger, it's Ken Russell's The Devils.
He plies me with caresses, lustful, obscene. He enters my bed at night and takes from me that which is consecrated to my divine bridegroom, Jesus Christ.
And what form does this incubus take?
I'm so glad you guys voted this one in. I absolutely adore this film. It was one of my favourite films to revisit and talk about this series. Again, if you haven't listened to my The Devils episode, there's actually kind of 2 episodes on it. There's me and Anna discussing it. Then there's me and Craig Lapper from the BBFC discussing it. And then I also talked to Mark Kermode about The Devils. So there is a lot of really interesting Devils coverage this series. Please do give it a listen if you haven't done so yet. I've got a couple of quick Devils related emails as well. This one comes from Hunter Robinson. Hunter says, I've always loved occult horror and I've really enjoyed this series. My favourite new discovery was Ken Russell's The Devils. The production design, the art direction and the performances were incredible. I'd heard about the film years ago and I'm so glad it was streaming on the Criterion channel so I could finally see it. Easily one of my top 5 favourite film discoveries from last year. Thank you so much, Hunter. And this comes from Trina Findlay. This is quite a long email. I'm not going to be able to read it all, but I will skim through it and read the relevant sections. Trina says, I approached this season of the podcast with anticipation and I wasn't disappointed. As always, you've reacquainted me with many old favourites and introduced me to some absolute gems. For me, the film that's had the greatest impact on me this series is The Devils. I was, of course, familiar with its notoriety, but otherwise it had somehow slipped under my radar. I listened to the episode before I'd watched it, and I was sourcing the web straight afterwards trying to find the fullest version on DVD. In the end, I opted for the BFI version, which I think certainly does it justice despite the missing scenes. I do hope one day Ken Russell's complete uncut version is made available. In this day and age where almost everything is available online, I can't see the justification for keeping it hidden. Oliver Reed is at his best, charismatic, enigmatic, and that searing gaze. Wow, his sheer presence is breathtaking before he even speaks a word. Vanessa Redgrave is also phenomenal, and she's disarmingly sympathetic in her portrayal of a sexually repressed and desperate nun. It's a bit of a cliche to say that the set was almost another character in itself, but it really did blow me away. It's strangely modern and minimalist, but somehow still fits perfectly as the backdrop to a 17th century setting. Absolutely amazing. This is one of my favourite additions to my ever-expanding horror library, thanks to the Evolution of Horror podcast. Thanks as always, Mike, and a huge thanks to all of your co-hosts. The wait between the episodes seemed to last so much longer than a week. Thank goodness for Patreon. Thank you so much for that lovely, lovely message, Trina. And I couldn't agree more there with every single sentiment made about The Devils. What an incredible, breathtaking film that is. So there you go. Your number 10 occult movie is The Devils. Now at number 9, a movie that we've already mentioned so far during this feedback session, a movie that wasn't covered during the series, and this is Ari Aster's Hereditary.
Hello?
Mom?
Mom? Mom?
I don't like this. Dad, I don't like this.
What's happening?
Please stop.
What's going on? Mom!
Please, you really freak me out. Please stop.
What's
Dad,
happening?
make it
Why is
stop,
everyone
please.
scared?
I'm so glad that even though it wasn't covered this series, so many of you in your droves voted for Hereditary as one of your favourite occult movies. I'll just read a quick comment. This was a Facebook comment from Will McMillan. He said, my favourite occult movie I would have to say is Hereditary. With as many horror movies as I've seen, it takes a lot for me to get shaken, but that moment in Hereditary completely pulled the floor out from under me. I had no idea where it was going. By the end, when you discover that the family never really had a chance, I was dizzy. Such a great movie, and I don't think a week has gone by that I haven't thought about it. Thank you so much for that comment, Will. I 100% agree with you. I don't think there is a single week that goes by that I don't think about Hereditary in some way or another since seeing it at the cinema. And you know, it's still a film that I've only seen once. I haven't been able to go back and watch it a second time yet because it's a film that freaked me out and got to me so much. I still haven't gone back for a second viewing yet, but I certainly will at some point. Maybe now that I'm in isolation, I'll give it a watch. So that was your number 9 pick, Hereditary. Number 8, this was one that did actually take me by surprise, but there is so much love for this film, a lot more than I expected, to be honest. Your number 8 occult movie is Ty West's House of the Devil.
They lied to you. I know. Okay, I know you're right. But it's $400. This equals first month's rent and then some, and all I have to do is sit inside and watch TV. This is huge. This one night changes everything for me.
I love this film. It's such an interesting, stylish film. I don't know whether I would personally put it in my top 10, but so many of you did, and I'm really glad about that. Here is a quick email from Tara Johnson. She says, "Hi Mike, thank you for the best series of the podcast so far. This series, my biggest first-time discovery was Ty West's House of the Devil, and it shot straight into my top 5 horror movies of all time. This film oozes atmosphere and dread. It's amazing how tense I felt throughout a film that mainly featured a teenage girl just wandering around an empty house." That's so true. I loved the retro style, I loved the music, I loved Greta Gerwig, and that final act didn't disappoint. I now need to seek out more Ty West. Where do I go from here? Thanks for all your hard work. Hope you're feeling better. Tara. Thank you so much, Tara. To answer your question, where to go from there, I would say go to The Innkeepers. That was, I think, his next film. He did a kind of real stripped back haunted house movie, which I love. That is currently streaming on Shudder, I believe, or it's definitely streaming somewhere. So yeah, if you haven't seen The Innkeepers yet, check that one out, Tara. And then after that, check out The Sacrament, which is a really scary kind of Jonestown-esque cult movie. So yeah, there's some other great Ty West movies to check out after House of the Devil. So thank you so much for that. That was your number 8 pick, House of the Devil from 2010. Number 7, this is another one that received a hell of a lot of love that I was actually kind of surprised about. This is Alan Parker's Angel Heart from 1987.
Do you by chance remember the name Johnny Favorite? My interest is only in finding out if he's alive or if he's dead. You want me to check it out?
What a great film, and I'm so glad that it's on so many people's lists. There was a hell of a lot of love for Angel Heart. I'm just going to read this one Facebook comment from Vincent Gain. Hello, Vincent. He says, Angel Heart is incredibly atmospheric and distinctly among the films discussed during this series. Angel Heart uses moisture. The grime of New York, the egg of Louis Cypher, the air of New Orleans, and the sweat that coats Harry Angel is palatable and inescapable. The demonic energy of the film manifests in this moisture, making it all the more pervasive and insidious. Not only does the sin and sickness come from the very air around Harry, it's also sweeping from him and coating him. There is the threat to Harry and the danger of the occult more widely. You are as responsible for what happens as the demonic forces you encounter. This conceit is common throughout occult horror, and some films leave you wanting to take a shower. Angel Heart utilizes the moisture of horror so that bathing in an ice bath afterwards might be appropriate. Thank you so much for that brilliant and eloquent comment, Vincent. You're so right. It's a very moist film, isn't it? It's a very wet film. It's a film that is as much about the look and feel and atmosphere as it is about the story. I absolutely love Angel Heart, and I'm so glad so many of you guys did. So that is your number 7 occult movie. That's Alan Parker's Angel Heart. Okay, moving into number 6 then. This is another one that is really, really dear to a lot of people out there. This is 90s teen classic, The Craft. So, your number 6 movie, The Craft. We got lots of little comments about this. I'm just going to read this one. This is an email from Hayley Fope. This says, Hi Mike, I was so delighted to hear that you were finally discussing The Craft, this series of the podcast. I loved your discussion of the film with Becky and Louise. It really did the film justice. This film was, for me, like so other people, a gateway into the gothic and the macabre when I was a 90s teen. I saw it at a sleepover and fell in love. It finally finally felt like a film made for me. It grew to become my favourite movie of all time, and one that I feel defines me as a person. Growing up as that weird goth girl, The Craft reassured me that it was okay to be the weirdo. Watching it now as an adult, I'm still impressed by the filmmaking and the performances, particularly the incomparable Fairuza Balk. To me and so many others, The Craft isn't just a great horror film, it's an important movie in my development and in my life. Can't wait for the next series. When will we be getting the full list? Hayley. Thank you so much, Hayley, for that lovely review of The Craft. And in terms of the list of films for the next series, yes, I will post that very, very, very soon. Usually I hold back on revealing all of the films and sort of release them gradually, but I think due to the current circumstances, due to the isolation, and I know that we all need stuff to watch, I will probably post the full list of films covered in the next series very, very soon. Okay, now we're into your top 5 occult horror films. Number 5 is one that I have not discussed this series because I have discussed it in another subgenre. This movie was covered during our folk horror series, but it is of course as much an occult movie as it is a folk horror movie. This is Robert Eggers' The Witch.
What went we out into this wilderness to find? Leaving our country, kindred, our fathers' houses. For what?
So there you go. It wasn't even covered this series, but you guys voted for it in your droves, and it was your number 5 occult movie. I didn't actually receive any emails or comments about the film, so I've got nothing to read for this particular one. However, of course, there were plenty of comments and reviews of The Witch in our concluding episode in the folk horror series. So if you want to hear more discussion of The Witch, go back and listen to our brilliant folk horror series. There's plenty there about Robert Eggers' incredible movie. I can't disagree with any of you. I am in love with The Witch. I think it's probably my favourite, if not my second favourite, horror film of the last decade. What a terrifying film. Okay, we're moving into the top 4 now, and let me just say there was an absolute huge jump in points. So numbers 10 through to 5 were all of a certain league, and numbers 4 through to 1 were pretty unanimous. Let's just say that. These 4 films were included in almost everybody's lists. So your number 4 occult horror movie is a witchy classic. It's Dario Argento's Suspiria from 1977.
Susie Banyan decided to perfect her ballet studies in the most famous school of dance in Europe. She chose the celebrated Academy of Fribourg. One day at 9 in the morning, she left Kennedy Airport, New York, and arrived in Germany at 10:40 p.m. local time.
Oh, God, that music. Okay, all right, here is a quick email from Matt Haig. Matt says, "Hi, Mike. I'm a long-term fan of the podcast. As a big Giallo head, I'm always a bit disappointed that you're not more enthusiastic about Italian horror, and I was somewhat worried that you were going to tear my favourite film of all time a new one, as I know you're not a Suspiria fan. Thankfully, the Suspiria conversation this series was celebratory and intelligent, so thank you so much. For me, Suspiria is a perfect movie and a pure transcendent cinema experience. From the opening shots in the airport to the final bonkers fairy tale-esque scene, I think it's a perfect movie and the most visually stunning horror film ever made. For me, it was a movie that took a few viewings to really love, so maybe you should give it another go. Thanks again for a great podcast, Matt." Thank you so much, Matt, for that email. I know, and look, there are so many of you that absolutely love this film. It's your number 4. You guys voted for it in your droves. I just wish I loved it as much as you all did. I really like it, actually, and this time watching it again, it definitely was a better experience than previous viewing experiences. And I get what you mean, Matt, that it probably is a film that grows on you with each viewing. But I'm so glad that you guys are, because I'm so glad that I was able to mention it in this top 10 list, because I know it's a hugely important film to so many of you horror fans out there. So that's Dario Argento's Suspiria from 1977. That's your number 4. Okay, moving into your top 3, and it's probably no surprise to hear that your top 3 are, of course, the unholy trinity of occult movies. 3 classics from the 60s and 70s that essentially are 3 of the best horror films ever made. So it's no surprise that they make up your top 3, but what order will they be in? That's the question. So, number 3, your number 3 occult movie is Richard Donner's The Omen. This film was pretty much on every single person's top 5 occult movies list. It may not have been at the top of everybody's list, but it was on almost everybody's list in some way or another. There's so much love for The Omen, and I completely get why. I am madly in love with this film as well. Here are a few little brief comments about The Omen. Paul Astbury said, "Hi Mike, another great series. I really loved the enthusiasm for The Omen. It's one of the first horror films I ever watched, and I thought it could appear hokey for today's audiences, and it's cool that it still stands up." Richard Sheltner says, "My favourite occult film? The chin-stroking snob in me wants to say The Exorcist, but the truth is I've seen The Omen far more times. Surely numbers of views is what really counts. Keep up the good work." And finally, this is an email from Paula Rice, who has a similar sentiment. "For me, no horror movie is more fun or deserves more repeat viewings than Richard Donner's The Omen. I've watched it more times than I can count, and I'm never not completely bowled over by it. Like your guest, Becky, I watch The Omen every year on Halloween, and it always makes me so happy. I love the sequels too." There you go. So much love for The Omen and the Omen sequels, actually. So many people listed The Omen 2 and 3. They narrowly missed out on the top 10, particularly The Omen 2. So there you go. That's your number 3 occult movie, The Omen from 1976. Into the top 2 occult movies then, and here's one that I'm really glad is as high up as it is, because it's certainly this high up on my list. Your number 2 occult movie is from 1968, Rosemary's Baby. What a film. I mean, it's impossible to talk about movies that are about occult and Satanists without mentioning Rosemary's Baby, isn't it? It's kind of like Occult 101. So, here's a quick email from Rebecca Selznick. She says, "Hi Mike, my favourite occult movie is Rosemary's Baby. Yes, it's an obvious choice, but there's a reason why it's considered such a classic. I put off seeing the film for so long, partly because of who made it, but also partly because it looked somewhat campy and ridiculous from the clips that I had seen. When I finally sat down to watch the film as an adult, I couldn't believe how wrong I was. This wasn't a movie about devil worshippers and demons. This was a film about gaslighting, about rape, about abuse. It's a film that literally ticks every single box. There's not one element of it that isn't perfect." Thank you so much for that email, Rebecca. And here's another quick comment from Alan Wilby on Facebook. "My favourite occult movie has to be Rosemary's Baby. The tone of the movie is of real creeping dread, and love the ending or not, it packs a very decent punch. Shocking in 1968 and still holds up. For me, it's a Stonewall classic if you can get past the Polanski thing and just take the film on its own merit." Yeah, couldn't agree more with what you guys said. It's pretty much a perfect movie as far as I'm concerned. So that's your number 2 occult film. That's Rosemary's Baby. Okay, well, now it's time to reveal your number 1 occult horror movie, and I'm sure it's going to be no surprise to anyone. This was first placed by a country mile. It really is still regarded as one of the all-time best horror movies, occult movies, just movies ever made, really. That is, of course, William Friedkin's The Exorcist. This email is from Robert Carth. He said, "Hi Mike, I tried to come up with an edgy, niche, interesting occult film like A Dark Song to call my favourite, but I'd only be lying to myself. My favourite occult film is William Friedkin's The Exorcist. This film makes you feel as though you've just looked in on something you shouldn't have. A dark, primal evil that shouldn't be messed with. Friedkin's documentary-style direction, with the award-winning special effects and sound design, and the Oscar-worthy performances from Ellen Burstyn and Jason Miller, not to mention Linda Blair, make for a pitch-perfect horror film. One that throws every type of scare at you in the book, yet never feels contrived or hokey. It's impossible to name a favourite horror of all time, but this movie would certainly be on the Mount Rushmore of horror." Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I mean, I would have to include The Exorcist in my Mount Rushmore, probably. Peter Jetnikoff has sent me a lovely email. I'm going to read you the whole email now. He says, "Hi Mike, I haven't heard all of the episodes at the time of writing this, as I haven't seen some of the films. Thinking about that, it might well reveal my relationship with the subgenre, in that I don't think I'm overly drawn to it. On the one hand, I'm happy to suspend disbelief to get immersed in a well-told tale, but if it assumes collateral belief, like religious or occult tenets, to function, I start drifting away. So, I'll buy the ghosts in The Innocents because their underlying motives are so compelling, but I struggle to fear witchcraft or a concept like unholy. If the underlying struggle depends on God and the devil, it might as well be between the red and the yellow wiggle to me. That Rosemary's Baby is Satan Jr. is less scary to me than gaslighting and manipulation and paranoia." Fair enough. That said, my favourite film from the series would have to be The Exorcist. The mounting tension in the house and the coldness of the world make it for a riveting drama. Father Karras' trouble is easily translated to one of the personal ethics, and the allegory of conflict between Reagan and her mother is an explosion of the energy in a dysfunctional family. Also, it's really good and bloody scary. Thank you so much to all of you for all of your emails, and thank you for sending in your top 5s and top 10s. So I'm going to run through it one more time. Your top 10 occult movies. At number 10, Ken Russell's The Devils. At number 9, Ari Aster's Hereditary. At number 8, Ty West's House of the Devil. At number 7, Angel Heart. At number 6, we've got The Craft. At number 5, we've got Robert Eggers' The Witch. At number 4, the original Suspiria. Number 3, The Omen from 1976. Number 2, Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. And number 1, The Exorcist. What an incredible list of films, and it goes to show what a fucking strong subgenre the occult really is. So there you go, that is your top 10 occult movies. And before we finish, I'm going to quickly run through my top 10. I won't take long on this. I won't stop and talk about any of the films, because you've heard me discuss all of these films in depth over the last few months. So we'll do this quickly. Here is my top 10 occult movies. At number 10, I've gone with Night of the Eagle. This was for me a first time discovery, and I loved it, and a fascinating discussion about it with Michael Blythe. At number 9, I've gone with the Hammer film The Devil Rides Out. I love this film. I'm surprised there wasn't a bit more love for it out there, actually. That's my favourite Hammer film. At number 8, this was another new discovery for me, this series. It was Starry Eyes from 2014. Holy shit, this movie absolutely knocked me for 6. I loved it. At number 7, I've gone with a kids movie. It's Roald Dahl's The Witches, the scariest kids movie ever made. At number 6, I've gone with one of my favourite movies to watch as a teen, The Craft from 1996. Now we're into my top 5, and at number 5, I've gone with the most recent film on the list. I've gone with Liam Gavin's A Dark Song. I think it is the best occult horror film of the 21st century. Into my top 4 then, and we're into the 1960s and 1970s exclusively. At number 4, I've gone with Ken Russell's The Devils. I think it is a gob-smacking movie, absolutely astounding. Number 3, I've gone with your number 1, William Friedkin's The Exorcist. I love this film so much, but there are 2 movies I like slightly more. At my number 2, I've gone with Richard Donner's The Omen. It is a film that, like you guys mentioned, is one of the most fun and rewatchable occult horror movies. And my number 1, I couldn't hide from it, I couldn't deny it. My number 1 favourite occult movie is Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. As problematic as that film is in so many ways, I absolutely love it. I think it is one of the most perfect, one of the most exquisite movies ever made, and it only gets better on every single repeat watch. That's Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. And that's it for this week, and that's it for this series. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to all of you for your contributions, for your constant support. It really does mean the world to me. This podcast is only still going because you guys keep it going. So thank you so much. There's going to be a hiatus now over the next few months, but I will still be out there on social media and on Patreon, and you can still get in touch with me. Email evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. Find us on Twitter @evolutionpod, Facebook @evolutionofhorror, and Instagram @evolutionofhorror. You can also follow us on Letterboxd to keep up to date with what movies we're going to be covering next series. And if you want to support this podcast financially and get treated to weekly bonus content, then you can sign up now, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror, and you'll still get a new episode every single week through the hiatus. If you haven't done so already, then please do spare a little minute to leave this podcast a rating or a review. It's particularly important during the gap when we've got no new episodes coming out, as it keeps the podcast in iTunes charts and it keeps the podcast getting discovered by new listeners. So we will be back in the summer of 2020 with Series 6 of the Evolution of Horror. And Series 6 is going to be the biggest one I've done so far. For those of you who follow me on social media and on Patreon, you will already know what the next series is, but I'm now going to reveal that Series 6 of the podcast will be called Mind and Body. Next series, we are going to be covering kind of two subgenres in one, really. We're going to be looking at all horror films throughout cinema history that have dealt with the horror that stems from within. Horror that comes directly from our own minds and our own bodies. So we're going all the way back to early cinema to look at early psychological thrillers like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, through to some of the original body horrors like Todd Browning's Freaks. We'll then be moving through the 20th century and we'll be looking at some of the big pioneers of these subgenres, David Lynch and his work on psychological horror, and of course David Cronenberg on his work in body horror. We'll be looking at the way that these two strands kind of interlink with each other. We'll be looking at some of the most extreme horror within the genre, like The Human Centipede 2 and Martyrs, but we'll also be looking at some of the most low-key, thought-provoking and psychological horror, like Les Diaboliques and Roman Polanski's Repulsion. So much ground to cover, so many incredible films to watch. Please do keep an eye on us on social media, and we will be revealing what films we'll be covering in what order. Cannot wait. But for now, it's time to say goodbye to the occult. Join us again very soon for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.